Hi, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Workforce Wednesday. Today, our topic is Tell Me About Yourself, and our presenters are Thalisa Laverne and Velta Worley from Workforce Solutions, Houston, Galveston area. My name is Olga Escamilla, and I am your host and moderator. I also have Laura Greer on, and she will be monitoring just in case we have any technical difficulties. So I'd like to welcome our presenters today. First, we have Thalisa Laverne, and she is a member of the Regional Texas Gulf Coast Navigator Team for Workforce Solutions. She specializes in providing training and education to the Gulf Coast community, career staff offices, and employers in assisting individuals with disabilities. She brings with her over 10 years of experience and expertise working in the nonprofit industry, serving Houston's disadvantaged community, individuals and families experiencing homelessness, victims of domestic abuse, and individuals and families experiencing hunger. Her great contribution to Workforce Solutions is her passion, commitment, and dedication to serve others. She holds a master's degree in organizational management, a bachelor's degree in training and development, and also in counseling, and a certification as a personal fitness trainer. So welcome, Thalisa. We also have Velta Worley, and Velta Worley is a member of the Regional Navigator Team, specializing in training, education, and assisting community partners, Workforce Solutions staff, and job seekers throughout the 13-county region with adult education and literacy and employment for people experiencing homelessness. She has over 8 years of corporate management experience, has been with the Workforce Solutions for 8 years as a facilitator, technical assistant, and office manager, and she holds a Bachelor's of Science degree from Sam Houston State University. So welcome, Velta, and you're on.
All right, thank you so much, Olga. And welcome, everybody. Welcome to our webinar today. We're going to look at some information and techniques that will assist your students with interviewing and with a focus on the most asked questions. So before we get started, this is the map for the Texas workforce development area, and there are 28 workforce boards throughout the state of Texas. And so I'd like to know what workforce boards you are with. You can either use the number or the name. For instance, we're number 28. We're with the Gulf Coast region. And we're also, I understand I think we have the largest region for the state of Texas. Our goal today is to go through the process of interview preparation and how to answer some of the interview questions. And towards the end of our presentation, we will provide information about key components in answering that wonderful question, tell me about yourself, and demonstrate it with a short video. We actually were able to embed a short video into our webinar. So now I'm going to turn the presentation over to Thalisa, and she'll do part of it, and then I will come back in a little bit.
Well, hello, everyone. Thank you for joining our webinar today. Allow me just to take a second and take you back in time, not too far back, but back to a time when you remember your last job interview you had. What was the first question that you were asked? Can I tell you a little secret? When an employer typically asks the question, tell me about yourself or tell me something about you, they simply want to know how the candidate's experience matches the job to which they're applying for, and it really is just that simple. It's not complicated. It's an open-ended question that the employer used to engage the interviewee in discussion. So if that's the case, why does this one question cause so much stress and anxiety, not only with inexperienced job seekers, but experienced job seekers as well? I believe there are three primary reasons why this question causes even experienced interviews a bit of apprehension. First, generally, the job candidate is not sure how to answer the question. Second, the job candidate is trying to figure out what information the interviewer is actually after. And lastly, the job candidate is just not prepared for the interview. So typically, it's one of three reasons that we're not prepared for that question. So let's look at preparation, because I believe, based on experience and my expertise, that it is paramount for a successful interview for the job candidate to be prepared. So the very first one, as we have already determined, is that preparation is the key to having an effective interview, thereby increasing the chance for employment. So let's discuss the top 5 steps to prepare for an interview. Okay, the very first one is preparation. As we recall, remember that the job search is an active and alive organism. Each part of the process is intertwined and equally important. Once the job candidate has passed the resume test and is called for an interview, the work continues. It doesn't stop there, and actually, this is where the real work comes in. The job candidate must remember that the resume is not what gets the job. It's actually the interview. And the job candidate has an opportunity during the interview to really prepare and come out of that interview with a higher probability of either getting a job or at least a call for a second interview. So let's just discuss the preparation process that improves the job candidate's chances for getting the job. Now, the following 5 key steps are essential for the job candidate. Some of these steps are interrelated, and I understand that. However, the value of each of these steps are equally important. The very first one, I listed this one because as a person that used to interview candidates, research. I believe that this step is so often overlooked or taken for granted. Let me give you kind of a good analogy. I recently purchased a car, but before I made the purchase, I spent a year and a half researching vehicles that would match my needs, my wants, and what I could afford. Well, looking for a job is no different. This is a business transaction that, if worked effectively, will benefit both the job candidate and the employer. Also remember, if a person, a job candidate, has been called for an interview, then that means that the interviewer is interested. So this is an opportunity to shine and to show them why they should hire you for the position you've applied. Also keep in mind that assuming you have already reviewed the job description and are familiar with the job entails, research the company's mission, value statement, goals, and other background information. Interviewers commonly ask applicants what they know about the company, and with a little preparation, you can answer these questions with confidence. It will definitely show the interviewer that you have taken some initiative. And one last thing I want to note on that, there is actually, honestly, no excuse for anyone that's going for a job interview not to be able to research and get the information about any company. You can Google anything. And there's just so much technology out there that there's actually no excuse. So, again, research is probably one of the most important steps in preparing for a successful interview. Now I want to show you a cartoon that I love this cartoon. So take a moment and digest this cartoon. Now look at it for a second. Would you say that this job candidate has done his research? This is a great example, a picture example of coming to an interview not prepared, not knowing the company you're interviewing for, what the culture is, and what specifically you are interviewing for. So thank you so much. Now the next step is what I call the 3 Ps, practice, practice, practice. Practice answering the most common behavior and role-playing interview questions. Most common question, 98% of the time, will be, tell me about yourself. Research the type of questions typically asked of people applying for the same type of job you are looking for, and rehearse answering them at home. For example, if you are applying for a managerial role, you might be asked how you've resolved a conflict between 2 employees. Once we've been comfortable with these steps, there are some ways we can practice. One of the ways to practice is to create a 30-second commercial. Some people call it elevator speech. The other thing is to practice in front of a mirror. Practice in front of another friend or a family member. Even with technology today on our cell phones, we can even record ourselves on our cell phone. Even just talking to yourself helps. So I call it the 3 Ps, practice, 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 because you can never practice enough. Now, the third one is just as important. As I said, remember, they're all interrelated, and they all kind of are equally important. The job seeker's first impression is critical to the entire interview. Remember the last cartoon we saw? The gentleman came to an interview with a tie on, but interviewing at a company a bow tie. First, you must set the tone of the interview. Second, the job seeker has an opportunity to influence the interviewer's perception even before the interview begins. And lastly, first impressions rarely leave our memory. So let me ask you a question. How long does it take you to form a first impression of someone? I will give you a few seconds to respond. Please use your chat box to record your answer. Keep in mind there's no right or wrong answer. Just tell me, how long do you think does it take you to form a first impression? 5 to 10 seconds, 2 seconds, 10 seconds, and body language. Body language is very important. It speaks of itself. Exactly. Again, thank you. You are a great audience today. Thank you so much for participating. Okay, thank you. And actually, according to a recent article for LinkedIn in 2016, it actually takes an average of 7 seconds to form a first impression. However, now keep in mind that there are several research studies that vary on the length of time that it takes to form a first impression. And some of you have already given that, 5 seconds, 10 seconds. I've even heard 3 seconds, 2 seconds. So we know whether it's 7 seconds, 5 or 10, one thing we can surmise from all of this is that the first impression counts and is very important. Do you know that in a job interview, answering all the right questions is actually only half of the story? Most candidates would be surprised to learn how much nonverbal communication, body language, truly matters. And actually, one of our participants mentioned body language. Thank you, Joseph. That is absolutely right. Often before we even speak a first word, an audience have already made up their mind about you. Nonverbal communication, such as your face and body signals, are important to making a first impression. Let me tell you, a recent study showed that 55% of first impressions are based on body language. 7% only accounts for actually verbal content. So let me say that again, because that's a powerful statement. Studies have shown that 55% of first impressions are formed based on body language, and only 7% account for verbal content. So action does speak louder than words. You start making nonverbal impressions from the moment you walk into the lobby door until the moment you leave. And some nonverbal mistakes truly can ruin your chance of a job offer, even if you answer those interview questions are impressive. Look at this quick chart, which pretty much support what we've just been talking about. Look, it says nonverbal make up 55%, spoken words only 7%, and even tone of voice carries more weight than spoken words. That's pretty powerful. So let's look at some nonverbal cues. Now, the very first one I've listed is handshake. People take this so for granted and never really give it any thought. But the first impression, again, is important and very important. So start off the job interview with a confident handshake and a nod to your recruiter's colleagues. This will give you an immediate advantage. And one thing you can do in the classroom is practice this one day. Just stand at the door one day, surprise your students, be at the door in the morning and shake their hand and ask them to introduce themselves, and then use it as a learning activity into the classroom. Now look at this picture. I love this picture. The handshake. This is your first encounter with the interviewer. If the interviewer holds out his or her hands and receives a limp, damp hand in return, this is not a very good beginning, and this is called the limp fish handshake because it's too soft, and it can signify to an individual that you are insecure, while a handshake of steel, too hard, can project arrogance. A handshake is a lasting way to tell hiring interviews that a handshake lasting too long tells interviewers that you might be trying too hard to impress them and that you might stretch the truth about your accomplishments. So equally important is a good handshake. By the way, did you know that 21% of interviewers will reject a candidate who gives a weak handshake? And that survey was conducted by Career Builders and ADECO staffing agency. Your handshake, look at this picture, should be firm and not bone crushing. Your hand should be dry and warm. A strong handshake is always a winner. And a handshake really can tell a lot about a person, and it's important to get it right at the interview. A firm grip is always ideal, as a lazy handshake can make an interviewer feel as if you lack enthusiasm. A good handshake could definitely make all the difference between landing the job or getting that second interview. Now let's look at our second one, eye contact. Eye contact. Now, with students, I'm telling you, this is just so important. Look, during the interviewer, it is important for the job candidate to look the interviewer in the eye. You don't want to stare at him or her like you're trying to look into their soul, but be sure to make sure the eyes meet frequently. Poor eye contact can signify that you are not interested in the position. Avoid constantly looking around the room while you're talking, because that can convey nervousness or a lack of confidence with what is being discussed. However, on the other end of the spectrum, too much eye contact can be intimidating and turn the interview into a stare down. Use reasonable contact to show interest and an opportunity to connect with the interviewer. Another bit of good news tidbit is, did you know that 67% of hiring managers cite lack of eye contact as the biggest mistake candidates make during the interview? Now we're going to play just a little bit of a game. Now I've shown you this picture, and what's wrong with this picture? I would like for you to identify the nonverbal cues in this picture. Looks like she's about ready to run out of there or call for the 911. But you're absolutely right. He's too close, he's too personal, and he's far too comfortable. Respect the personal space of the recruiter. You don't want to convince the recruiter by leaning as close as possible against him or her. Make sure that you're not sitting or standing closer than 1 millimeter or not more than 3 meters away from your recruiter. Personal space is really, really important, so keep that in mind. And now, another nonverbal cue is body language. We've discussed that, and Joseph came up with that, and that's really, really paramount. It has been suggested that body language may account for between 50 to 70% of all communication. 50 to 70% of all communication. Now, I have another picture. I love pictures. Can you tell? Take a second and look at this picture. The woman on the left is the interviewee. Keep in mind that she has not said a word at this point beyond pleasantries. However, her body language is speaking. So what does it communicate to you? I agree. Sitting up straight and smiling looks like a great attitude. Ready to discuss business but still nervous. Pleasant yet professional. Very good. You're all absolutely right. You do want to be pleasant, yet you always want to be professional, and it does display a sense of confidence. Smile is the best makeup you could ever wear, and posture and her appearance are very, very upright and speaks a lot. So speaking of posture, I'm going to show you one more picture. This is a picture of someone who is far too comfortable. And he states, well, I'm well organized, have great attention to detail, and I'm a perfectionist. So his posture is way out of line with this one. Thank you. Now, the last one we're going to look at is facial expression. Now, what's wrong with this picture? If you're looking at this picture and that's the message you're getting, guess what? If this person was in an interview, then guess what? That's the same perception that the interviewer is getting as well. So thank you very much. The one that says look worried, confused, no eye contact, nervous. She looks uninterested, almost wringing her hands. You're all very correct. Thank you so much. So you're absolutely right. Here we have no eye contact, Her posture, her hands appear to be, even if she's not nervous, she does give the appearance of being nervous. Also, she looks down, no eye contact, as if she lacks confidence in her ability to even be there and answer the questions. What about her blouse? No one mentioned that. But I've gotten some responses that felt like her blouse was inappropriate because the button was too low. Again, it's a matter of perception. But keep in mind that whenever you're interviewing, the job candidate is interviewing for a job, you want to be conservative. And this might be construed as not being conservative. Another interesting study indicates that 39% of interviewers are put off if a candidate fails to smile. Maybe not ironed properly was the response. It does look a little wrinkled, doesn't it? Thank you so much. Okay, now I have another picture that you're just going to love this one. Now just take a second to see if you spot the inappropriate nonverbal cues during this interview. Now he's on the other end of the spectrum. Hungover. Is that a cigarette in his hand? Slouchy, smoky. So I had to slide down and see, holding, feeling like a cigarette. What is he drinking? Probably vodka. But again, realize that this is a matter of perception, and everything that we do, from our eye contact, our handshake, how we sit, how we respond, how we do all of these things in an interview are paramount, and an interviewer looks at all of these things, and he is just far too comfortable, and he doesn't appear to be really interested in the job. He looked like he just came back from going out all night and forgot he had an interview that morning. Okay, so we've discussed, so let's just talk about preparation. So how do you prepare? For example, there is a difference between work attire and interview attire. For example, I may wear scrubs to work if I work at a hospital, and that would be okay for everyday attire. But I wouldn't wear scrubs even if I was interviewing for a nursing position. So also keep in mind, some interview attire may be appropriate for, again, some industries, but not others. For example, a lawyer usually wears a three-piece suit in the courtroom, but a machinist at a plant will not, and neither will I. And that's okay because my line of work calls for business casual, which means nice pants, shirt, and tie. And here are some examples of what I think are some very appropriate interview attire for women. And also, just for your students, if you have some students that perhaps, particularly your female students that have an issue with attire for an interview, there's an organization, it's a nonprofit organization called Dress for Success, and they provide free interview attire for women who have a lack of financial resources. So keep in mind, it's called Dress for Success, and they provide interview attire for women. All right, so let's look at the men. This is very nice dress for an interview. And again, if you've done your research, then you know the company you're interviewing with, you know what the culture is like, so you know to dress appropriately. And all of these are very, I would lose the bag, but all of these are pretty good interview attire for men. Same for men. If you have any male students that have lack of financial resources for interview attire, there's an organization called Career Gear for Men. Again, it's called Career Gear for Men, and it does provide free clothing for individuals, male individuals that need attire for an interview. So we have business casual versus business. So as you can see, business casual is over to the left and business is over to the right. There's no right or wrong answer, but a good rule of thumb is to wear clothes a step above what is normally worn at a place of business when going to an interview, but you don't want to go too far. Would you wear a suit and tie to interview for the cashier position at a fast food restaurant? Probably not, but at the same time, would you wear just a T-shirt? I wouldn't advise that. So in general, think conservative when choosing clothing and accessories. For instance, instead of a neon red, choose something like a maroon color. Reduce the bling. In other words, jewelry for ladies and men as well should be kept to a minimum. And don't ever go overboard with cologne or perfumes, because there are some people that do have allergies to certain scents. And of course, comb, brush hair. Men should shave and wear slacks or trousers like Dockers, but never wear blue jeans. Some may argue that point, but remember to wear something a step above. For ladies, heels are acceptable, but not too high, and keep them low. Overall, you get the point that our dress should be conservative. Now, I know you think some of this is elementary, but your students really need to understand that all of these things are paramount if they're to get a job and to be successful in the workplace. And so interviewing clothing is just as important as body language, as just as important as nonverbal cues. So please keep that in mind when you're discussing this with your students. Okay, so let's look at, we're still in the preparation phase, so we've talked about research, the 3 Ps, first impressions, now questions. This next step informs us to ask questions. So why do we ask questions? Well, we ask questions because we're looking for a job and we want to show the employer that we're interested in the job. And they will, but for the person being interviewed, asking questions in a lot of cases definitely sets you apart from other job candidates. So make sure your students understand, don't be afraid to ask questions, and they should be prepared to ask questions. So what kind of questions should they ask? Well, after they've researched and know their target, then this will give them a great illustration of how the steps are related. So knowing your target, the employer gives you information about the company as well as the position. And from that, you can develop questions that go a little deeper into the superficial type. Let me give you a good example. I interviewed years and years ago for an intake specialist. I had 10 candidates. I narrowed it down to 3. And out of the 3, I only had one that asked questions, and that was the one I called for the second interview, simply because she showed interest. She took the time to research the organization that she was applying for. She knew enough to ask me a couple of questions about the job, and so she was the one I called for the second interview. So it's really important to ask questions. So what questions do you not ask? Well, good questions to ask. And remember that an interview is a two-way street. A potential employer is asking questions to learn about you and your skills. However, in return, the job candidate must and need to be prepared to ask questions about the potential employer and about the position. In addition, if you don't prepare smart questions, you run the risk of the interviewer assuming that either you're not interested or you're just simply not prepared for the interview. Your opportunity to ask questions usually come at the end of the interview. You must prepare at least 2 questions that demonstrate your interest in the position, your drive to excel in the role, and the fact that you have done some research on the company. Here's a really great question. I love this question. And it says, can you tell me more about day-to-day responsibility? This is the job candidate's chance to learn as much information as possible about the role so they can decide whether this is a job they really want. Remember, an interview is a two-way street. While you may want the job, but you also want to make sure that you're working for a company that meets some of your needs and expectations as well. So by learning about the day-to-day tasks, you also gain more insight about what specific skills and strengths are needed, and you can address those topics if they haven't already been covered during the interview. Here's another good question. So what do you think are the most important qualities for someone to excel in this role? This question can often lead to valuable information that's not in the job description. It can help you learn about the company's culture and expectations so you can show that you are a good fit for this job. Here's another really great question, and you are more than welcome to take these questions. When do you expect to make a decision? This is a good question. Nothing wrong with asking the interview when they anticipate making a decision. Why? Because it shows that you're interested. Now, very quickly, I'm going to go through some questions that are not to ask. And there are some questions you simply do not want to ask in the interview. Anything related to salary or benefit, you should never ask. It's wise to research the salary range of the position which you are applying for. And negotiation is something that's possible, but this is not the stage where you discuss that. Besides, the employer may get the opinion that all you care about is the money and not the job itself. Asking about a background policy might tell the employer that you have something to hide. You definitely do not want to ask, will I be drug tested? It's not your business to know about the previous candidate. That's another one. Do not ask about previous candidate or the person you're responding. The worst question is the one you never ask that shows lack of interest or preparation. Again, what not to ask, anything related to salary or benefits, we discussed that. Drug or background check policy, we discussed that, and why that's important, about the previous candidate. And not asking questions, any question at all, is just as worse as asking a really bad question. So the bottom line is be prepared to ask questions. And the last one, and finally, most important, is follow-up. This can be the difference between you and another candidate in the selection process. A good idea, and I do this quite often, or I did when I was looking for a job. Not that I'm looking for a job now. A good idea is to take a few note cards with you to the interview. These can be purchased for a nominal fee and leave a thank you note with the receptionist or secretary. A second one is follow up with an email within 24 hours of the interview. But in the email, make sure that you outline 2 to 3 skills that specifically relate to the job and why you're a good fit. And mention those key points discussed during the interview. Then you can follow up with a phone call 1 to 2 weeks after the interview. So I read an interesting article very quickly today that said, do not send a thank you email. Now, I have some concern about that. Here's another experience. I interviewed for a case manager position. I had 5 candidates. I interviewed them all. They all interviewed extremely well, had the experience and the expertise. But out of 5 candidates, only one sent me a thank you email. So guess who got the job? The one who sent the thank you email. So thank you. You can never thank anyone too much. So I believe in thanking. It's just the right thing to do. Okay, so in conclusion, there are 5 key steps to effectively preparing for an interview and to improve your chances of getting that second call. So thank you so much for your participation. Now I will turn the second half of our presentation over to Velta.
All right, thank you, Felisa. And part of preparation is the use of CAR, C-A-R, during an interview. And you've probably heard of this. It's an acronym that stands for Challenge, Action, and Result. The CAR statement is a simple method to remember a brief story that you can tell an employer that summarizes an accomplishment or something that you've overcome. Maybe you had a conflict in your previous position. It's also a good way to answer behavioral type questions. Felisa talked about behavioral type questions. They're the ones that begin with things like, tell me about a time when, or give me an example of how. And then the employer wants you to answer. So having some developed CAR statements can really help in being prepared and in sounding very professional. So with the challenge, what challenge was being faced that needed to be resolved? You can even think of it in the context of something you learned resulting from a weakness you may be trying to overcome. I had a challenge years ago with a customer who had come to me, and of course, our challenge was to give above and beyond customer service. So she had come to me and she was complaining about the traffic and the construction and how long it was taking to get there, and she just didn't think she could be, continue to be my customer. And so what I ended up doing was pulling up, Google, looked at where she lived and where other facilities were that provided the same type of service. And then the result of that was that she became one of my best customers. She stayed with me for years and years. So I've always remembered that story, and I've used the CAR statement to be able to talk about that story. So the next one is action, which I talked about. What action or actions did you take to make sure the challenge could be resolved? And of course, the response should always be positive. And then the results. What are the results for you or the company? This is a good time to include measurables if you have them, such as you reduced something by a certain percentage, or you increased monetarily by so many dollars. Employers love hearing results explained in terms of numbers. So we're going to look at a few examples of CAR statements. I'm going to present you with the statement, pull out important parts of the statement, and I want you to identify which is the challenge, the action, or the result. So let's go to our first little story. So in this one, initiated and launched customer questionnaire survey at City Auto Service, resulting in a collection of 2,000 results, leading to improved customer satisfaction by 98%. So think about which part of this was the challenge, which part was the action, which part was the result. So in this story, customer satisfaction was improved. So that, what would you call that part of the CAR statement? It could be the result. It's also the challenge, because their challenge was that they apparently, you read between the lines, and that there's a reason for increasing customer satisfaction. So they were having a challenge with that. So the collection of 2,000 survey results was what part of the CAR statement, which is pretty simple. The action, absolutely. And then 98% customer satisfaction would be the result, absolutely. So that one was pretty easy, and you can see that it was really easy to just kind of compile this, and how great this would be for your students. You can incorporate a lot of things into your lesson plans for them to come up with CAR statements on their own, just, based on stories that they have. So let's look at the next one. So reviewed 4,000 preventive maintenance procedures for computer chips and eliminated 1,000 extraneous procedures, reducing the cost of transferring data by nearly $10,000. So this time, what was the challenge that they had here? They were looking to do something. What were they looking to do? Absolutely, reducing the cost, and it was of, transferring data. So what was the action they had to take in order to reduce the cost? They reviewed, absolutely, and in this case, they put in a number which looks really good and sounds really good to an employer by having those numbers. And then the result was that they, what? They reduced the cost. And by nearly $10,000. So those are just a couple of examples of CAR statements, and CAR statements are really important in having that preparation, for getting ready for an interview and answering those interview questions. So I've put together this little sheet. You could do something like this on a little card, or a piece of paper, make it fun for your class. You could use it especially like in ESL where you're working on language and coming up with the right words for things. But, describe a challenge you had. And what action did you take and what were the results? So this would be a great way, this would be a good activity with your students so they start thinking about how they would describe themselves in situations they have had in their past that produced positive results. We also recommend that job seekers have 2 to 3 examples of CAR statements, especially when they take to an interview. which will help them answer interview questions confidently, as well as starting to answer that fun question, tell me about yourself. So let's look at some typical interview question. What do you think is the most commonly asked question by employers in an interview? And of course, that's what the topic of our discussion is. It's, of course, tell me about yourself. And I'll never forget the first time, and I was right out of college. I went for my first interview, you know, with my little college degree. I was so excited. And the first question was, tell me about yourself. And I mean, I literally was unprepared. I didn't know how to answer the question. I had never really been on a real interview before, because before that, my jobs were in high school, you know, doing fast food and that type of thing, so I never really had a real interview. So I was totally unprepared. So how should this question be answered? But we're going to move on because we're getting short on time. One of the ways is to use a 30-second commercial or elevator pitch. You've probably heard about these terms in your past. If you think about TV commercials, they're typically 30 seconds or less. Super Bowl, they're even less than that because it costs a lot of money, so they want to get their information to the public in the shortest amount of time and with the fewest amount of dollars. But they're designed to capture attention. So that's what a job seeker should do. They should have a 30-second commercial that is very brief, but it gives all the information that the employer is asking for. So what I like about a well-constructed 30-second commercial is that if you remove the personal pronouns, it can become a really good summary for your resume. So you could try this out with your students. You could make an activity out of converting their resume summaries into a 30-second commercial, or vice versa. They come up with a 30-second commercial, and then they can start creating that resume summary. So that was just a thought that I had. So now let's look at the top interview questions. So there are the top 10 common interview questions. I'm not going to read through them, but if you have ever interviewed, you've probably seen some of them or all of them. But you can see that there's questions about strengths, why should I hire you, what motivates you, what makes a good team player. So, and can you see that some of these questions could be answered using the CAR statement? And it's possible that a brief CAR statement could be used in the 30-second commercial. So now I'm going to give you a moment to read an interview question and give 3 answer choices. So the first question is going to be that really fun question, tell me about yourself. So response A is, what do you want to know? Response B is, my name is James Dean, and you can read that for yourself, but he talks about his experience, that he's got equipment and all of that. And then C, I have been out of work for about 6 months, and I really need a job. I mean, I'm not sure how I'm going to pay my bills this month. I'm truly willing to do just about anything if you give me a chance. So, yes, I think all of us said B. Absolutely, that would probably be the best answer. The response in A shows that he either didn't know how to answer the question or he was completely unprepared. And then the response in C is that it's too personal, and he kind of made it all about him. He's got bills to pay. Well, we all assume that someone who wants a job has, needs the cash. Right, desperation, absolutely. So let's do one more question. Tell me about a time you had a difficult work situation. So again, this is a good opportunity to have some sort of CAR statement. So A, in my last team project, he talks about a team member, but then he recommended that the manager review the performance. B, I get along with everyone and can't think of a time I had a difficult work situation with anyone. Or C, when a new member was hired, there was a large learning curve for us. Eventually, we managed to collaborate. So, yeah, C would probably be the best response. A is pretty negative, isn't it? And he kind of puts down a previous coworker, which probably doesn't show that he is necessarily a team player. B doesn't really give an answer, although it's very neutral and says, well, I always get along with everybody. Okay, so y'all are seeing the entire slide. Thank you. So B could have probably come up with something. So maybe the person wasn't necessarily prepared for this question or hadn't thought about it, didn't have a CAR statement. We have this, to conclude the short activity, here's an illustration of what not to say, and we just kind of wanted to throw that in there. So overall, there are several key points necessary to have a successful interview. Prepare, 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 research the company, know your skills and abilities, and be able to discuss them during an interview. Remember those first impressions, watch for those nonverbal cues that we discussed today, and that it's formed in a matter of seconds. And then you never get a second chance to make a good first impression. And then lastly, stand out above the rest.
Great information. Y'all provided some really great information and some good examples that can be used in the classroom. So we thank you because that is our goal, is to provide different workforce activities that we could help our students, because our goal is not only to take our students from high school equivalency or ESL to training, but to get them into a job and help them be able to keep that job. So we thank you very much for providing us with this information, because it's really great. And I love the different strategies, the CAR strategy, so that our students can really be prepared. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Have a great rest of your day, everybody.